أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد أشرف المرسلين وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome back to another episode of the Aqsa Frontline Podcast, an initiative of Stand for Palestine, where once again we're delving into the political issues surrounding the Gaza conflict in particular, and more broadly the occupation of Palestine and the situation of the Ummah, looking at these political issues from an Islamic lens. I have with me once again Amir. Assalamu alaikum Amir, and welcome once again. This past week we have seen an increase in the severity of the crimes committed by the Zionist occupation. We know that for the past 4 months we've had an ongoing genocide in Gaza. There are many crimes that have been committed against our brothers and sisters, where now we're reaching the number of 30,000 that have died, let alone those who are still lost underneath the rubble and the 60 or 70,000 who are injured. On top of that, as if that wasn't enough, as if the 1.8 million displaced wasn't enough, the Zionist occupiers have now decided that they will be going in and attacking Rafah. Rafah, for those who don't know, is the southernmost city in Gaza. Gaza is made up of 5 main regions. Rafah borders with Egypt right on the bottom. And throughout this conflict over the last few months, the Zionists have been trying to force the people of Gaza down south, slowly filtering them, attacking the northernmost areas and sending the people south, telling them you'll be safe further south. The people fled towards Khan Yunis. They were then told, you're not safe in Khan Yunis. We have to enter into Khan Yunis to attack or get rid of Hamas. They told them, go towards Rafah. And so the people fled towards Rafah. Today there are 1.5 million people seeking refuge in Rafah, many of them in tents. And now they're being told even Rafah is not safe for you. And the Zionists have made up and concocted their story because they haven't achieved any military goals in their past 4 months. Now they're saying that in order for us to achieve our military goals, in order for us to defeat Hamas or to capture their major leaders, we have to enter into Rafah. The people of Rafah have nowhere to go. There have been some airstrikes in Rafah. There have been hundreds that have been killed so far. But the talk is about a ground invasion into Rafah, which would lead to devastating effects for the people of Rafah, for the people of Gaza, and would lead to crimes worse than even those that we've seen so far. Amber, can we start off by going through the incidents at Rafah? Why have the Zionists taken these steps, and why is this the threat that they're now making?
First we begin with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wa hlul 'uqdatin min lisani yafqahu qawli. The Zionist occupation, as we see before our own eyes, is going forth with their plan of seeking to displace the people of Gaza. Now, we saw from the beginning of the occupation of Gaza in this war, there was a lot of talk about trying to displace the people of Gaza. And there was some talk about sending them to Sinai, into other countries, into Jordan and whatnot. And when they started their ground incursion into Gaza, they started from the north, if you remember. And they gave clear instructions to the people of Gaza in the north that they must evacuate from the north to the southern part of Gaza. Now, if we remember, many of the people in the north of Gaza decided to stay in the north of Gaza and not evacuate, despite knowing full well that their decision to stay in north of Gaza was going to have severe implications. And this decision came with them knowing that it is like a death sentence, that the chances of dying in north of Gaza because they have not evacuated to the south of Gaza was very high. Whether it was through the bombing, whether it was through the ground incursion, whether it was through being arrested and tortured, as we saw many images of thousands of men from the north of Gaza who were taken, rounded up like sheep and taken by the Zionist occupation, stripped naked. We saw all these images. And a lot of them have been tortured severely. Some of them have been released and have spoken about what they went through. The severe torture they went through, interrogations, some people being executed right in front of them, families being executed point blank, and they've kept some children alive, and these children have witnessed their mothers, their fathers, their grandparents at point blank shot in front of them in north of Gaza. Now, when the occupation went into north of Gaza, there was heavy battles there, if you remember. And eventually, after many weeks or a few months of heavy battles inside north of Gaza, they withdrew their troops, but they continued the ground assault and the airstrikes on north of Gaza. Now, what we need to understand is that the people that decided to stay in the north of Gaza, this was an act, one of the biggest acts of martyrdom operations that we have ever seen in our history. We are talking about over 500,000 people from north of Gaza have written upon themselves martyrdom for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in order to protect their land and to fight for their honor and defend their land. By knowing full well that by them deciding to stay in north of Gaza, that the chances of them dying or being martyred is very high. So these people, with what they've done, we owe them the gratitude, because what these people done and what they've achieved was they've put an end to, not put an end, they've put a big obstacle in front of the occupation in terms of trying to displace the people of Gaza entirely into Rafah and then into Sinai. And because these people have valued the defending of their land, defending of their homes, defending of Gaza above their own lives, they have put a huge obstacle in front of the occupation. And today the occupation failed in taking over all of north of Gaza. And if those people actually listened to the occupation and they all went to south of Gaza and there was no one left behind, then today we would be speaking with a different tone. We would be speaking about a military occupation north of Gaza entirely, with military bases being established for the Zionist occupation, and that area would be a military zone that's occupied entirely by the occupation, and the people of Gaza will be all of them inside of south of Gaza. But because of these 500,000 to 700,000 people that are still there today in north of Gaza, this did not go ahead. And because these people decided to stay there and not listen to the occupation forces, now they are being punished with a severe siege that is leading to people dying from hunger, starvation. The people in north of Gaza have eaten everything they can find in north of Gaza. Grass, they've eaten animal food like bird food or grain, and they've eaten, I've seen a video of them eating a dead horse today. They've eaten everything they can, and they've reached a stage where there is no food. Imagine a people who have money in their pockets. They don't lack money, they have money. But what's the use of money if you cannot find anything to buy? If you cannot find any food, you cannot find any water. So there are cases of dozens of people in north of Gaza who are dying due to starvation as we speak today. And nothing is allowed to enter into north of Gaza. And who is responsible for this mass punishment against the north of Gaza and against the people of Gaza? And I'll leave it with you to explore that further.
I think it's important for us to understand, like you said, to just really, really picture the severity of the punishment that they're facing, and for us to really appreciate how big of a sacrifice that is. We talk about the Palestinian people, like we see the people of Gaza and the sacrifices that they've made, and I think everyone has grown an appreciation for the level of iman and taqwa and tawakkul that they have. These are people who believe in Allah Azza wa Jalla. Like, when we talk about what does believing in Allah mean, this is a live example. This is the greatest example that you can see. This isn't some philosophical discussion. This isn't some textbook that you read and write. This is people that live and demonstrate to us what it means to sacrifice for the sake of Allah Azza wa Jalla. Over the past 4 months, we've seen them, whether it's the ones who their entire family has gained or has won shahada in front of them, and they accept it. They don't have a complaint. They don't have a single complaint against Allah Azza wa Jal. They accept their fate and they say, Ya Allah, this is our sacrifice for you. We see the likes of, for instance, 2 weeks ago, we saw Dr. Amir Al-Asuli, who operates out of the Al-Nasser Hospital, Al-Nasser Medical Complex in Khan Yunis. One of the doctors who, when the battle began, she was in Egypt 4 months ago, before October 7, with her family. And then when the war broke out, she knows that myself as a doctor, I have responsibility to my patients. As a Muslim, I have responsibility to my brothers and sisters. She crossed the border to come back towards her hospital and serve her duty there, and to sacrifice for those 4 months, where she's an obstetrician gynecologist. We know, for example, at the start of this battle, there were 50,000 pregnant women in Gaza. And you can picture how hard that is. And there are children that, stillborns and miscarriages, and children that are born premature, and they've suffered so much. So her and her duty in that role is able to obviously serve these people. And then we saw the scenes a couple of weeks ago when Al-Nasser Hospital was under siege. And today, or as of the past few days, Al-Nasser Hospital has been completely overtaken by the Zionists. They've arrested many of the doctors. They've driven out the people. They've left patients with no care. They've left them to die. And we saw a clip where the snipers were set up outside the hospital. They would shoot people wherever they could see them. So nurses were getting shot through the operation room windows. Children were being shot playing in the hospital courtyard. Doctors were being shot inside their restrooms where they'd go to sleep in between all of these hours that they're doing, and they would be shot inside those rooms as they're resting. And we saw a clip where Dr. Amira ran across. She saw somebody that had been shot and was on the floor bleeding. And there's nothing between her and them to protect her. There's nothing to protect her from the snipers except the protection of Allah Azza wa Jal. She didn't hesitate to think for a moment, what do I do? She took off her jacket, gave it to somebody else, ducked down. She didn't look to see who else is going to go or who's going to volunteer first. She didn't even think. And she ran, nothing to protect her, to reach that person. Another doctor reached her as well. Makeshift stretcher. They carried this person back into the hospital, did what they could to save his life. I've seen so many instances like this. Why am I mentioning this? Because the people of Gaza are heroes. Everyone knows this. The people of Gaza have done their part. But we've almost normalized their bravery and their heroics. As if it's normal. We look at them and it's become normal that these people are sacrificing so much to achieve this resistance against the occupation. We saw the photo of one of the men who was arrested, hands behind his back, he's stripped down to his underwear. In front of him is a Zionist soldier, and he's standing up with his chest, braced. He's got his head lifted up with pride, with honor. He's blindfolded. And the Zionist soldier in front of him looks like he's the one that's carrying, even though he's the one that's armed and free, right? And we look at that and people share it as, look at how strong this man is. But at the same time, he's imprisoned and he's arrested, and there's a report that he was killed a few days later. So yes, we embrace the bravery and the heroics and the sacrifice of the people of Gaza. They've done their part. But in doing so, do we neglect the fact that there's a duty on the rest of the Ummah and the rest of the world to go and save them? That we've accepted their heroes. You know what I mean? And therefore it's normal that heroes go through hardship. They're human beings, just like you and me. You and me will go through hardships, right? When we go through hardships, no matter how much we can brave it up, no matter how much we can rely upon Allah Azza wa Jal and accept that sacrifice, it's still a struggle. You need somebody to come and help you in that moment, and the people of Gaza are no different.
Yeah, there's a brother in north of Gaza. He writes a lot on X and Instagram, etc. And he wrote along those lines about that picture of the Palestinian that was that was handcuffed and looking up at the soldier. And he said, this is to the Muslim Ummah. Here's another picture for you to celebrate our courage and resistance, whilst we are dying from hunger and starvation and bombing, whilst you guys are just celebrating our pictures of resistance. It's like, we can see you celebrating the pictures of resistance coming out of Gaza, but we don't see you next to us to help us. And it's become like this where, just waiting for the next courageous scene that comes out of Gaza for us to celebrate and say, oh, look how courageous they are. Look how brave they are. Look at their iman, look at their tawakkul. But where's our iman? Where's our tawakkul? Where's our courage? Because they're doing this in order to stay steadfast as much as possible whilst waiting on the Ummah to come and help them. Because if we want to talk about the reality on the ground, we are talking about a people that are sieged, that are starving, they have no food, they have no water, they have no basic necessities for human life. They have a handful of groups of resistance fighters fighting against a army that has endless supply of weapons and intelligence and everything you can ask for. Okay, and these are people that have the whole international world order has prevented anything from reaching them, even donation money. You're not allowed to send money to them. And if you send money to them, you can be deemed as a terrorist sympathizer, terrorist supporter. Imagine that. So these are people that are starving to death. You're not allowed to send food. You're not allowed to send money. Banks are closing down accounts. Western Union is not allowing any transfers to reach the people of Gaza. So there's an international decision, a unified decision by the world powers, by multiple countries, including so-called Islamic countries and Arab regimes, to cut everything off from these people. And as we speak, like we said about the people of North of Gaza, the fact that they are starving to death, literally starving to death, this is a decision by the international world order. It's not just a Zionist occupation. Everyone that has an ability to bring in aid or to stop the war and has not done so up until today is complicit in these crimes, is a partner in these crimes, including the Arab regimes, including the Muslim regimes, including all the Western governments. Every single one of them has the ability to put an end to these crimes and to lift the siege by force. They have the ability, they have the capability. But they refrain from doing so because they are on par with the same international world order that placed them there in the first place. And it's not enough for us to sit down and watch and see these courageous scenes and just praise them and make dua for them. There must be more that the Ummah can do in order to put more pressure, in order to help them, to stand by them.
You know, we talk about the people of Gaza, and they've always done their part as well, not just for themselves. Like, you know, this concept, like we spoke about this in the first episode, but understanding the concept of being one Ummah and of sacrificing for your fellow Muslims. When back in 2021, there were the incidents in Sheikh Jarrah, in Al-Quds.
Well, that was the sword of Al-Aqsa battle, correct?
That's right. So it started off with the displacement in Sheikh Jarrah, in Al-Quds, and then there were the attacks or the aggressions in Masjid Al-Aqsa. And as a result, the people in the West Bank came out first. And they were marching in the streets, and there were a few clashes and so on. And they started chanting in the streets, Ya Gaza Yallah, Mishan Allah. Gaza Yallah, for the sake of Allah Azza wa Jal.
There was a call, I remember, from one of the masajid there in Masjid Al-Aqsa as well, saying, Aina antum ya Rijal Gaza, etc., etc.
And they responded.
They responded.
They responded. They sent their airstrikes. They sent their missiles. They sacrificed. They had a couple of thousand who died in that battle over a period of a month or so. And then a truce or an agreement was reached. But they came, even though it wasn't their land that was being attacked, even though it wasn't them that was getting killed, this is one struggle. This is one struggle for Masjid Al-Aqsa. It's one struggle for the occupied land. It's one struggle for Muslim blood that's being sacrificed. And so they were willing to fight back and to sacrifice for this same cause. Now today when Gaza calls out to the rest of the world, who responds? They've done their part. And they've continued to do their part historically and today. When we talk about, who's responsible for what's happening in Gaza, of course we know, firstly and primarily, those that are most responsible are the Zionists themselves, the occupiers. They're the ones who commit these crimes every single day. They and their soldiers, who every single one of them is an outright terrorist who commits crimes and barbarity that we can't even picture how a human could do the things that they do. We know that responsible for their crimes are those who fund them, such as America. And America's image in the world is shattered. This rules-based order, their justice and their freedoms that they spread to the rest of the world, that image is shattered across the majority of the world. We know they're responsible for the billions of dollars of aid that they send, of weaponry, of support that they send, their constant vetoing in the UN and so on. We know that they're responsible. We know that responsible are also the countries that are closely affiliated and aligned and support through their propaganda and militarily and financially the Zionists, such as the UK and such as, for example, France, such as Germany, such as Australia, who continue to do their part to support the Zionist aggression. Although sometimes they might sprinkle in a few words in between that, we stand for all human life, or Israel needs to show a bit more restraint. In reality, their actions...
They need to kill them a bit in a nicer way.
Yeah, we just want a nice genocide. The genocide that we can sell to the world.
Yeah, because it's going a bit too much. Yeah. Just cool down a bit, chill out a bit. Look how we've done it in Iraq, in Afghanistan over 10 years. Kill slowly. There won't be much outrage. We're okay with that. But you guys are doing it within 4 months. You've beaten the world record of how many we kill. And it's more than some world wars, they say.
Yeah.
The amount of people they've killed. More than the world wars.
The extent and the speed.
So they've ever done it. They're setting the bar too high now. So the next world war, they have to try and achieve what the Zionists have done in Gaza. So
they want a genocide that's marketable to the world. A genocide that we can sell. So there's a bit of, words and things and a bit of pressure that they exchange. But in reality, we know that their actions completely support and they are complicit in the genocide that's happening in Gaza, right? But then we need to talk about who's responsible elsewhere. And we know that those who do the crimes are responsible. But then the question becomes, okay, am I going to call upon the Zionists to stop killing? Right? It's in their definition, the definition of the word Israel is like occupiers, right? Like their whole existence as a state is established on these exact crimes that we see today with the Nakba. 750,000 driven off their land, right? Tens of thousands killed. That's the existence of the whole state. We don't expect anything to change from them. America, imperialism, especially within the past 100 years, what we see from them today is no different than what we've seen with them in the past. Whether it's in Japan, whether it's in Vietnam, whether it's in many countries that have entered through very various means, whether it's Afghanistan, Iraq, and so on, and then obviously with the Zionists. So we don't expect them to change. We don't expect any sympathy from them. And similarly with these other countries as well that are on the same page, their entire policy when it comes to foreign policy, when it comes to the Middle East, when it comes to these issues in particular, is exactly in line with what we see today.
It's funny because you see some people comment, they say, I'm surprised by the stance of the world. I'm surprised the world is standing by. Actually, I'm surprised by you being surprised.
Yeah.
How could you be surprised? This is normal. We've seen this for the past, in our lifetime, we've seen it for the past 20 years at least, of the crimes that these Western powers are capable of in Muslim world, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in the different parts of the world, and tyrants that they've supported, they've propped up. We've seen this time and time again. So, no, we're not surprised. This is their ugly face being shown to the world, and their masks have been ripped off by the people of Gaza.
And I think it's because these crimes are covered up very well, historically. And so people don't see the extent of what's happening. You can only imagine the things that were done in Iraq that were covered up, Abu Ghraib and the images that came out of that. When people saw that, that was a shock to them because they've never seen anything like this before.
When the images came out, it was after the fact. We didn't have live streams of this coming out like what we see today. So I think that's where the difference is as well.
That's right. And so, like you said, the mask is being ripped off. But I don't think it's reasonable, like you said, to expect anything different from these countries. This is how they have been in the past. This is how they are, and this is how they always will be. It's in their definition of how they've built up their power, the colonialist expansion of Europe, their colonies that they set up in the US and Australia and Canada and so on, their policies through spreading their democracy and their freedom to the Middle East, into Asia, their expansion into Africa and so on. This is literally their entire history, right? To expect anything different from them would not be reasonable. To call upon the UN would be a waste of your time. The United Nations are the ones who established the occupation of Israel.
Of Palestine.
The occupation, as in Israel's occupation, in 1947 and 48, when they then created the UN partition, right? And they gifted this land and they granted this land to the Zionists. And not to get too much into the details, but even the UN in their actions since then have demonstrated that they understand we are responsible for the crimes that have been suffered by the Palestinian people and the refugees. That's why, for example, UNRWA exists, UNRWA, as a specific refugee agency only for the Palestinian people.
Yes.
And before that, the UNCCP. The only reason that they exist is because the UN was directly responsible for Palestinian refugees, because the UN was the one that created the problem that led to the Palestinians being driven off their land in the first place.
Yep.
The United Nations is entirely complicit in the occupation of Palestine, right?
Yep.
And in the division of this land, and the land being given to the Zionists and the formation of the State of Israel. And they've continued to be complicit over the decades. They haven't done anything at all to help in this situation. They didn't play their part to support, for example, the genocide of the Bosnian Muslims. They failed on this front in many different times and eras. And the only role that they play is to further prop up and perpetuate the same current world order that has existed, the same status quo that has existed since the formation of the UN after World War II. So to expect anything different from them, especially with the systems that they have in place, whether it's the veto system or America just overrules anything that they try to pass anyway, whether it's the fact that they have no authority anyway. So even when they say, ICJ, and even if they would come out even harsher than they did and say, yes, Israel's committed genocide.
Then what?
Then what?
What next?
Exactly.
That's it.
They have no authority to enforce anything except to suggest to others, you should do something as well. And we spoke about the other nations. It comes down to us as Muslims. Even when we look at Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the suffering that he and the Sahaba faced when they were in Mecca. We never once saw the Prophet ﷺ or his Sahaba going up to the leaders of Mecca and begging them and pleading them to stop their punishments. We never once saw them, go up to them and tell them, look, we are fellow Arabs and fellow Qurayshis, we're from your tribes, have some mercy on us. We never saw them call upon other outside Arab tribes to come and help them when they came to Hajj, for example, tell them, come and support us in this effort. They never once tried to get the oppressor to show mercy on them. This wasn't the example of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. As an ummah, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam with his Sahaba around him took the steps that were necessary to protect themselves. Today we have an ummah. We don't talk. It's so depressing when we think of the weakness of our ummah. We have 2 billion people, 50, 60, I don't even know how many, 70 nations, right? You look at the extent of the wealth of our nations, the strength of their militaries, the political strength, the strategic locations.
Resources,
we have an ummah.
Everything.
We have an ummah. We have Muslims, right? Why do we spend all of our effort talking to the non-Muslims, talking to the exact same systems and leaders and countries that created the occupation, that led to it being formed, that sponsor it and that prop it up for the past 75 years? Why do we talk to them to seek their help to help in this situation? How much of our effort, and I'm speaking primarily to Muslims in the West, because Muslims in the Muslim world know this. They don't bother speaking to the West. But us as Muslims living in the West, we spend a lot of our effort speaking to, the non-Muslim world order and so on.
Yep.
But we need to shift our focus.
Yep.
Talk about who's responsible. We know that the oppressors are responsible. Sure, you're not going to change them overnight. So the question is, what do we do as an ummah? And who do we hold responsible within our ummah for the state that we're in, so that we can't defend or even send in a bottle of water to save the people of Gaza?
Yeah, if you look at it, and you look at the situation today where nearly 2 billion Muslims are watching as a genocide is happening in front of their own eyes, and they are not even able to allow a bottle of water to enter, a bit of food to enter, medicine to enter, to stop the genocide. And you know what kills you the most is that, when you're watching the genocide happening in front of your eyes, it's different than when you hear about it happening without actually watching it. Because when you are watching it and you have shackles in front of you that prevent you from going there and helping or putting an end to this genocide, that's even worse. Imagine yourself tied up, chained up, both your hands, your legs, and you're sitting there, and someone in front of you is deliberately punishing your family, your daughters, your wife, and right in front of your eyes, within an arm's reach. And you are tied to this chair, your hands are tied, your legs are tied, and you cannot help them. You're just shackled. Like you really can't do anything. You're shackled, yeah? In this instance, do you give in to the shackles, or do you keep shaking and budging and trying to free yourself from these shackles in order to help your family and fight this man that's, punishing your daughter in front of your eyes, your son in front of your eyes, your wife in front of your eyes. Any human being would be going crazy in that chair and trying to free himself from these shackles in order to do everything he can to stop this oppression, to stop this oppressor, and put him back in his place. So when we as an ummah today watch what's happening in Gaza, the question I pose to the Muslims primarily, and to non-Muslims, but to Muslims primarily, is because we have an obligation that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has set upon us. And this obligation is to stop an evil. Okay, when we see an evil, with our hands. If we can't stop it with our hands, then with our tongues. If we can't stop it with our tongues, then with our hearts, and that's the weakest of Iman. And the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ told us that this ummah is one ummah. And when we see our brothers and sisters in Gaza being tortured, being killed, genocided, sieged right in front of our eyes, do we accept the shackles that have been placed upon us? Should we accept these shackles that have been placed upon us and use this as an excuse to say there's nothing that we can do? Many, especially in the Muslim world, many use this excuse. In Jordan, in Egypt, they say there's nothing that we can do. That's the excuse. These are the words that are being used. They have accepted these shackles that have been placed upon them, which is the regimes that are preventing them from going there and helping. Say there's nothing in our hands.
Before we go into that, just because I know the discussion is getting into the ordinary people and what we can do and what we need to do. But before we go into it, I think just to unpack it for everyone is, if we can just talk about the regimes and the rulers in the Muslim world and how they failed, just to unpack that a bit more. Because I think there's a lot of details that people miss sometimes.
Yep.
Understanding exactly what's expected of them, Islamically, politically, and where they failed and how they failed, and then understanding how that responsibility trickles down.
Yeah.
Even from a Shari'i perspective, the concept of what we call jihad al-difa', which is defensive, fighting defensively, right? Anyone who suffers where you're being occupied and your lands are being occupied and you have to fight to repel that aggression, right? If you live in a land and a foreigner comes to occupy your land, it's a fard upon the people in that land to fight to repel that aggression. If you've been overtaken and you don't have the sufficiency to achieve the goal that you have, which is to prevent your occupation, to prevent your defeat in that battle, the responsibility, the scholars say, then goes upon the people in the nearest lands. And then if they're unable to, then in the next nearest lands and so on. So we're looking at two things here. Number one is proximity, and number two is sufficiency, right? Proximity, obviously we know the people of Palestine, and we've talked about the people of Gaza and what they've done, but the reality is the people of Palestine are limited in terms of their resources. They don't have a country, they don't have a economy, they don't have a military, and we'll talk about all of these things that are necessary for a state. They don't have any of these, and they don't have the sufficiency to fight to repel an entire occupation. For that, you need nations, you need armies, you need political authority, and so on, which we have in the neighboring countries. And so we look at neighboring in terms of proximity, the likes of Jordan, the likes of Egypt in particular, Syria, who all share borders with the Zionists. And then we talk about sufficiency as well. You have so many others within the Ummah who are also capable of doing something. That's from the topic of doing something actively to remove the occupier. But then there's the obvious aspect as well, which is that when somebody is occupying your Muslim brothers and sisters, you don't support them. Doesn't matter whether you're close, doesn't matter whether you're sufficient in terms of you have the military necessary to overtake them, for example. To go and support the ones who are occupying is something else as well. And so when we look at these surrounding nations and regimes, right, to talk about the example of Egypt, when we talk about Rafah, for example, and this is something that I wanted to explore with you a little bit before we start talking about the people. The Egyptian government has been quite steadfast since the start of 4 months ago that they don't want the people of Gaza to be expelled into Sinai. And they've rejected that claim. And some have celebrated it, saying the people of Gaza don't want to go to Sinai. And the words that Sisi uses, for example, are, we refuse because we refuse to accept your plot of driving the people of Gaza out. So is this an act of sincerity from Sisi? Is he being sincere in saying that, no, I'm blocking off the border so that the people of Gaza can remain in their homes rather than being driven out? Or is there something else behind it?
Yeah, I mean, like, Definitely, like we know Sisi is originally from Gaza. he's a courageous leader. In all serious talk, you mentioned before how these regimes have failed. You said that multiple times. Actually, I think these regimes have been successful at pleasing their Western masters, at implementing what the West wants from them. They have been very successful. So they haven't failed in that job task. Because remember, when they came into power, every job has a job description. Their job description is, you are a puppet to the West, full stop. That is it. You have no authority. You have no national, you have no independence. You have no authority over your lands, over your decisions, over your army, over your resources. You are there as a puppet, full stop. So when Sisi comes out from the beginning and says, we are against the displacement of the people of Gaza into Sinai, yeah? What does that even mean? Now let's unpack that. What are the practical steps that are needed in order to prevent the displacement of a people? If you want to stop the displacement of people, let's narrow it down so people can imagine this, yeah? Let's say you're sitting at home, you're sitting in a house, and a fire breaks out. A big fire breaks out downstairs. And your neighbors come rushing. And you can't leave this house. The fire has engulfed around downstairs, so you can't get downstairs in order to leave through the front door. You're only upstairs. You can leave through the windows upstairs if there's avenues like ladder or something. So your neighbors come around and they surround your house and they start chanting for you. We are with you so you don't become homeless. We stand by you and by your right to your house. And you're screaming, there's a fire in my house. I need to save my life. But they are screaming back saying, stay in your house, otherwise you become homeless. What have they done here? They've pretty much sentenced you to death by watching you burn to death in that house because they are with you and stand by you in your house and they don't want you to become homeless. So when Sisi comes out and says that I am with the people of Gaza, we don't want the people of Gaza to be displaced. Meanwhile, there is a genocidal entity with terrorist occupation forces bombing through air, land and sea, and occupation forces and intelligence, genociding non-stop and a humanitarian situation which is killing the people due to hunger, due to injuries, due to illness. And at the same time, you block the border. Not only do you block the border, you build a second wall, you build a third wall, you build upon the third wall. Okay? You go above and beyond to please your masters. And you prevent the people of Gaza from receiving aid, from leaving. And some of them that want to leave and can leave have to pay a bribe of up to $30,000, $10,000, $8,000, different prices. A bribe per person to leave Gaza into Egypt. And then from there, you sort yourself out where you want to go after that.
For those who don't know, Sinai is a desert, tens or hundreds of kilometers away from main civilization in Cairo, Alexandria, and the main cities. When you go to Sinai, you're not in much better of a situation than, especially without food and resources and whatever else that money. You know what I mean? You're not in a situation where you're free and you're living a life that people would envy. You're struggling. You're on the streets. You're in the middle of the desert.
That's right, and that's why the sentiments of the people of Gaza, they understand what Sinai is. They know what Egypt is. A lot of I have a friend that's from Gaza, and he's in Australia. And he goes to Gaza every few years. And I asked him, I said to him, how hard is it to get to the borders? Why? I'm trying to understand why the people of Egypt haven't mobilized to the borders to break the borders open. I'm trying to understand, how hard could it be? And he said to me, for me, when I go to Egypt in order to get to Gaza, so you enter into Egypt, and then you have to go towards, there's another checkpoint to enter into the Sinai desert, and then it's like a 30 to 50 kilometer drive in the desert in order to reach the Rafah crossing. And then the Rafah crossing, there is 3 different walls around Gaza, and the checkpoint there it's very tough conditions. They are treated very bad. The people of Gaza are treated really bad on the crossing between Gaza and Egypt. Treated very poor conditions. They sleep there a few nights in order to enter. They go through hell in order to enter Gaza.
Heavily guarded, immense security, army.
Yeah, that's the normal days. Army everywhere. Obviously, army not to protect the people of Gaza, but obviously in order to serve the Zionist occupation. So when you are talking about normal days, that's how it is. So imagine when there's a war. Imagine when there is a genocide happening, and the sentiments of the people of Egypt is that they do not accept it for themselves to see what's happening in Gaza. Yet, when they say we can't, there's nothing in our hands to do, then we understand, when we understand the reality on the ground, we understand why they can't break the siege of Gaza. But before we go into that, so when Sisi says, I'm against the displacement of the people of Gaza, if you are really against the displacement of the people of Gaza, then you have to extinguish the fire that's burning the people of Gaza. Not block them inside that house and give them the option of either dying from the fire or dying from the fire. You have not opened up a pathway for them to exit the house that's on fire, and you have not provided the sufficient, or you have not provided any means for them in order to extinguish the fire. So what you have done is you have sentenced the people of Gaza to death. That's the reality. And that does not mean that Sisi is against the displacement of the people of Gaza into Rafah, into Sinai. In fact, Sisi is open to the idea as long as there is monetary benefit for him and his ruling class and the top class of the army, and obviously people that can benefit from it.
At the right cost.
At the right cost. If the price is right, we open up the borders. But maybe we might not open up the borders. Maybe the Zionist occupation is going to bomb the borders when they invade Rafah, when they go in on foot. One of the scenarios is they go in on foot, and they also occupy the crossing between Egypt and Gaza. That's one of the scenarios. And they are the ones that open up the borders, and naturally the people will leave into Sinai because there's nowhere else to go. Or they bomb the Rafah border, and the people enter into Sinai, fleeing the genocidal entity, the machine. And then Sisi will say, it wasn't us, it was the Zionist entity, they did it, we were against this. But somehow, by coincidence, we already have tents set up in Sinai desert, we can put them in there. And these coincidental cities that have been propped up recently, obviously in preparation for possible people migrating from Gaza into Sinai.
And even if, talk about military, put out the fire, which is essentially stop the Zionist occupation or stop the genocide in Gaza, and even if, let's be honest, nobody expects that from Sisi, even if you were to make an excuse that for him and for the Egyptian military and so on, at the very least, what you should be doing in that scenario is a completely open border between Rafah and Sinai to provide refuge for those who need it. Like, there are people trapped in Gaza who need urgent, serious medical care. People with newborn premature babies, people with severe conditions, people with no money, with no food, etc., who need care. You need a completely open border. If Egypt is completely in control of the border, as some claim, then you need a completely open border where you're able to send in aid as it's needed, and those who need to leave can leave. Just like you mentioned, for example, the fire in the house. Even if you're unable to put out that fire, yes, you want to protect that person from being homeless. You know what I mean? So you make an option for them to escape so they can save their life if they need to. And so that if you need to send aid for further people in there, you need to send masks, you need to send oxygen, whatever, right? Something to help them survive in that moment. Then you send whatever resources that you need to send. But instead, what they've done is that they've reinforced security. They've reinforced the military presence. And I think part of it as well, like Sisi fears a mass displacement of the people of Gaza into the Sinai. because that's a population, a few things. Number one, that Egypt isn't ready to take on economically, which is why, like you said, for the right price. What does that mean? Isn't just about personal price, but it's a political concept, right? The people of Egypt are struggling. They've been struggling since Sisi came in, and it gets worse and worse and worse. You know, you speak to people in Egypt and you look into their economic situation, how far worse the Egyptian pound has gotten, the insane cost of living crisis that the people are suffering, the cost of food. People are unable to live in Egypt, right? And so when you talk about bringing in the population of 1 million, 2 million refugees and somehow having to accommodate for them, that's a crisis that Egypt can't bear. And the other part of that equation is that when the people of Gaza are migrated towards Egypt, you've got a whole other security concern now, right? When you talk about trying to get, so many political commentators talk about how getting rid of Hamas is an impossible goal. Because whether it's because of their numbers and their ability to survive, whether it's because of the concept, it's an ideology, right? Which will naturally, from any perspective of analysis, which will naturally continue to exist among the people of Gaza. That as a child, when you've killed my entire family, or as a man when you've killed my entire family, I will seek whatever means to resist. Now put those people into Egypt and put them under the care of Sisi and get him to try to now maintain and to calm that and to prevent any escalation of their emotions.
To go back into Gaza and keep fighting, yes.
That's a security issue that he doesn't want to deal with.
Yeah, for him it's a security issue, yes.
Massive. Against him and his government. And then from them firing against the Zionists saying Egypt hasn't done its part to protect us. And then there's so many possible escalations there.
That's right.
It's not something he wants to deal with, not because he cares about the people of Gaza not wanting them to migrate, but there's a self-interest there. And like we said, there's whatever commands come from the American masters at top. We know Sisi and his background and how he came into power and his links with America and so on, right? And it's very clear where his allegiances lie. That's Sisi as an example.
Yeah. I mean, that's Sisi as an example, and we saw what Sisi has done to his own people. Where he massacred his own people in Rabia during the military coup.
That's right.
So if he's more than willing to massacre the Egyptian people, imagine what he's more than willing to do against the people that are not from his own national identity, as he says, or nationality in Gaza. He couldn't care less what happens to the people of Gaza. That's a reality. But what really what pisses me off is, like last time I was reading a comment by a sheikh. He wrote something. He said, we say to the people of Gaza, stay where you are and do not flee into Egypt, because by fleeing into Egypt, you have left your home, you have left your land, and you have not defended your land. I'm sorry, but where were you when you said this comment? In which Western country or which Islamic country were you sitting down, living comfortably in your couch or on your bed and writing this comment on your phone or writing this status on your phone? Who are you to say these comments to a people? Did you live a day under the bombardment of F-16s? Did you live a day under the gunfire of snipers, or under the quadcopters, or the occupation that's on your doorsteps and tanks rolling in? Where were you when you made this comment? And what did you provide to the people of Gaza? When you are wanting to make comments like this, you need to remember what they've endured up until today, the people of Gaza. And that what they've done is more than enough for them. They have done more than what they are capable of. And the rest falls back on the Ummah. So when, in reality, if they move into Sinai, it's not because they have failed, it's because we have failed as an Ummah to stand by them. And the other point is, who said we should accept these borders in the first place? Who said that Sinai is for the Egyptians and Rafah is for the people of Palestine or people of Gaza? Who fed us these notions for us to believe that this border that we see in the videos of the people of Gaza, when they take the videos and the images of these borders, they say, here is Egypt and this is Gaza. There is life and this is death. Okay? When you see this, how stupid is this really? That this wall that was built now separates a people, whilst we know that many of the people of Gaza are actually from the same tribes as the people of Sinai. Did you know that? So people of Sinai that live in Egypt and the people of Gaza that live in Palestine, a lot of them are intertwined in the same tribes. They're from the same family background, from their relatives. So these are the same people. But there was a border that was placed between them in order to separate them. So when we say the solution is to remove this border between Egypt and Gaza, remove it, what's going to happen? Believe me, the people of Gaza, more than anyone else, do not want to leave their home, their Gaza. They don't want to leave. But if they do leave, it's because they have been left with no other choice but to leave temporarily with the hope of coming back. They are not leaving because they hate the land. They are not leaving because they've given up on the land. They are not leaving because they have given up on resisting the occupation. They are leaving because they have no other choice in order to protect the lives of their remaining children, if they have any left, or to protect their own lives, to care for their children temporarily whilst they wait for help from the wider Ummah. And that's where these borders are really a problem. And at the same time, when you remove these borders, now aid can come in. Whatever the people of Gaza need can come in. All these trucks that are lined up, parked with thousands of tons of aid and food and all that stuff, that can come in easily. So we need to understand this, that these borders, we shouldn't accept these borders in the first place, and we shouldn't accept this argument that Sinai is for the Egyptians and Rafah is for the Gaza people. And when an Egyptian comes and says to me, we can't handle any more wars, we fought enough for Palestine in the 1967 war, 1973 war, and we've done our part as an Egyptian army, and our economy cannot withhold any more pressure. Whose economy? Whose army? Whose people? At the end of the day, we're all one people.
That's right.
And we are all one ummah. And if they are going through a hardship, we will also go through a hardship until we help them lift the oppression.
The concept of one ummah and trying to break apart this concept of borders between us, I think a lot of people don't recognize the history of our nations. And it's funny because all of these countries have their Independence Day, their national holiday, whatever it is that they celebrate when they form their nation with their borders, with their government and so on. You compare this to the Ummah, the Islamic Ummah as we know it historically, which existed as just one body, one state, which had one rulership that served justice towards all of the Muslims. Look at the example of Umar al-Khattab radiallahu ta'ala anhu. When they were suffering a famine in Medina, and he had control of an ummah which spanned all the way to Egypt, through Asham, into Persia and so on, he worked, subhanAllah, the genius of Umar al-Khattab as a statesman. He worked to funnel the resources of the ummah, what they had in Egypt, and he was dealing with the issue of the plague in Asham and so on, and he worked to redirect the resources of the ummah to make sure that there was equal access so that they could bring resources into Medina and help supply the people going through the famine and so on. This was seen as one ummah, and there was never a complaint from the people of Egypt that, Ya Umar, why are you taking resources away from us? This is our food. It was seen as, these are our Muslim brothers, this is our ummah, these are resources that are shared between all of us. When the Muslims would struggle due to, for example, an invading force elsewhere, historically, the army of the Ummah, the army of the Muslims would come and defend. No matter where they were stationed, no matter where the conflict was happening, this is one Ummah, right? And obviously there are exceptions when the Ummah was divided, and that's the point, that the Ummah was divided and the army wasn't there to defend them. But when we were able to function as one Ummah, we saw they were able to work collectively, right? There was never a concept of this is my land, this is your land. These borders that divide us today were drawn up by the colonialists, the Sykes-Picot borders in particular, 1916, sitting down with a pen and paper, literally drawing these straight lines in between our nations, many of which have no basis at all, many of which were deliberately drawn in a way so as to cause conflict between people, to split up certain tribes or to group certain tribes together so that they would then increase in their conflicts against each other. This was a design, right? This was designed to cause conflict between me and you. And we're talking about Egypt as an example, but Egypt is just an example. It's not like Egypt are the ones causing the crimes and everybody else is innocent or everybody else is doing their part. They're not. Everybody else is part of this as well. Jordan on the other side, which again, like the Jordanian army has reinforced its border with Israel so much over the last 4 months, not to protect its people, but to protect the Zionist entity from its own people going and marching to those borders. They've arrested people who have even talked about going to the borders, right? We've got King Abdullah, mashallah alayh, the hero that he is, riding in a helicopter and then airdropping aid into Gaza to help supply supposedly humanitarian aid to the people, as if that's what's expected of him in his role, right? Obviously collaborated with the British and with the suppliers that were funded by the British, and in collaboration and agreement with the Zionists that I'm going to be on this plane and then airdrop this aid. That's not what's expected of you. You have power, you have an army, right? If the Zionists were bombing Cairo today, Egypt's response would not be the same, of the government or of the people. And that's where the problem lies. If the Zionists were bombing Amman today, the response of Jordan, the government and the people, would not be the same as it is today. And that's the point. The responsibility that comes down on our governments is respond to the call of your Muslim brothers, just like the Ummah has in the past, just like Rasulullah ﷺ and the Khulafa did, right? These borders shouldn't be the cause of division between us, just like we're talking about Dr. Amir al-Asuri earlier, who crossed that border because she saw her responsibility. Sure, her background is from Gaza, sure, she comes from there originally, but she had the option to say, look, I'm safe in Egypt. I don't need to sacrifice my life for these people. But she chose to take that sacrifice. She chose to go back and to serve her people. And so the same responsibility falls on each one of us. The Egyptian army, the honorable Egyptian army, the historic Egyptian army, which has strength and power, like, where are you to defend the people of Palestine? It's not there, right?
Yeah, and historically, like a lot of the battles that started the army that would take off from Egypt would go through Gaza to go fight battles against the Mongols and others. And so we saw that these borders were not there in the first place. And Egypt, as a place in the Ummah, played a huge role in repelling aggressors around the world.
That's right.
Yeah.
I think one thing that's worth emphasizing is that the responsibility comes upon the people, like you said. The rulers, we know where they are. The rulers have shown their treachery over the decades. The rulers have shown us that they're not going to sacrifice for the people. Then how about the people? And you were mentioning previously the responses that we see from some of the people in Egypt that we've sacrificed in the past for Gaza and so on. Yeah. And within the Muslim Ummah more broadly, right?
Jordan, they say our army partook, and we've already provided a lot of things for Palestine before. You see many other Muslim people that have that nationalist identity mentality. They use these excuses. Why should our country be dragged into this war? You started this war. That's what they say. You started this war. You deal with it. Yeah. Or why should we drag our country into a war that's going to impact our economy and impact our safety and security, so-called safety and security? Meanwhile, this same man that's saying this, that we live in safety and security, is barely making ends meet in order to feed his family because of the economic situation of the country.
That's right. Even when you look at examples, like just to give a few more examples, like Hezbollah, right, operating out of South Lebanon, and they've had their skirmishes and their conflicts over the past 4 or 5 months with the Zionists as well, and they've had 250, 300 that have been martyred among their ranks. But when you hear them talk, they or their supporters, and they say they haven't gone in full blast, they recognize that they haven't gone with all of their strength, and they say the reason is because if they know that if they go in too harshly immediately, they will invite war into Lebanon, right? Iran, and why don't they attack and so on, is because they don't want to increase the scale of this war. We need to understand what that means. What we're saying there is that we're willing to accept that the conflict, because we understand now, no matter what response you want to say anybody has taken, their responses haven't stopped the aggression in Gaza. Nobody has stopped the aggression in Gaza, right? That means that we're willing to accept that the aggression continues in Gaza as long as it doesn't expand into my country, right? I'm willing to accept that people are dying in Gaza as long as they don't die in Lebanon. I'm willing to accept they die in Gaza as long as they don't die in Iran. I'm willing to accept they die in Gaza as long as they don't die in Jordan. So all of a sudden, we've seen that a life in Gaza is worth less than a life in Jordan. And we've taken this concept on. We've taken on this mentality as Muslims, right? As people that supposedly have this concept in the هذه أمتكم أمة واحدة. It's ummah of yours is one ummah. We've forgotten that, and we've taken on the concept that our lives have different values. And so this comes down to the people as well, that so many of the people have the right sentiments, they have the right concepts. They reckon, like, nobody in the Muslim world, doesn't recognize that the Zionist occupation in and of itself is a crime and that we need to expel the entire Zionist occupation. Nobody in the Muslim world, very few, don't recognize that the rulers are treacherous and that they've betrayed their duty towards Gaza and towards the Ummah. Nobody denies that, right? But what next?
Yeah, so I think that's where it's the realization is there now by the people. Yeah, the people know that these rulers and these regimes have stood and they've aided the Zionist occupation. But there's something that's stopping them from taking a further step in order to hold to account their rulers and these regimes. Hold them to account in the real sense. Hold them to account where the Prophet ﷺ said that أفضل الجهاد كلمة حق عند سلطان جائر. أفضل الشهداء حمزة
سيد الشهداء
حمزة بن عبد المطلب وذا حديث رجل وكلمة الحق عند سلطان الجائر فقتله. That's the greatest of jihad. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, يا أيها الذين آمنوا ما لكم إذا قيل لكم انفروا في سبيل الله ثاقلتم إلى الأرض. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, ثاقلتم. Like, look at the word. When you read it, ثاقلتم. This is a thuqul. It means you've clinged onto life.
Can you translate the ayah?
That, oh, you who believe, if it is said to you, go forth in the path of Allah, then you chose to hold on to life. You know, you prefer this life over helping your brothers and sisters. أرضيتم بالحياة الدنيا من الآخرة. Have you, Allah says, have you preferred the life of this dunya over the hereafter? فما متاع الحياة الدنيا بالآخرة إلا قليل. And what is the beauty and the bounty of this world compared to the hereafter except for little? So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling the people these ayat, telling the Muslims these ayat and the hadith, these are needed at these times in order to tell the people that what you are living in this world, like the people of Gaza, they have preferred the hereafter over this world. Despite this sense of security, despite this sense of safety, despite all these false senses that people are living, that can be flipped overnight, like we saw in Gaza, where people with a family, with children, with kids, with a beautiful home. You know, you see the videos of their houses are much more beautiful than our houses here, mashallah. Yeah. And the people of Gaza, mashallah, people that are well off. People don't think they were poor people. The people of Gaza, many of them are wealthy people, mashallah, through their trade, through their businesses. They have a siege, but they had beautiful homes, they had beautiful jobs, they had a beautiful family, they had dreams. And all of this was turned overnight. And their houses were destroyed, and their children were killed overnight. So this false sense of security and safety that we are going to live on this earth forever, and we are not willing to get out of our comfort zones in fear of losing our job, losing our lives, losing our wealth, losing our sense of security, sense of safety. These fears that prevent us from taking that extra step that might be that step that prevents the next genocide from happening, that might be that step from that impacts or moves someone with influence and with power to get involved and stop the war. Those actions that are needed at this point of time, where the people of Gaza are asking for these actions, they're asking for help, because they know that it's not enough for us to just sit down and watch and keep on watching and counting and tallying up the number of deaths, tallying up the number of injured, collecting a number of images of heroic people of Gaza, retelling the stories of the heroic people of Gaza. That's not enough. That's one small part of it. Now that small part, I think we've overdone it now. There has to be something more.
That's right. And
when they come out with their messages of resilience and courage, they also say, we are also hurting. We feel betrayed. We feel like everyone has let us down. And because you have betrayed us, because you haven't supported us up until today, because you haven't gotten involved up until today, you know what? We're not going to call upon you anymore. We're going to call upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. We've had enough. The fact that you haven't moved to come and support us and stop this war, we feel like we've been betrayed. And I don't think we should have let it come to this stage where the people of Gaza feel like they've been betrayed. And they feel like that the Muslims are living their lives normally, and they've gone back to their normal routine of lives, their normal routine in their lives, because it's been 5 months, it's too long for us, we can't keep up, watching these videos, it's disturbing our day-to-day lives, our routines, it's too much, we get over it, like it will end eventually, we need to move on. And when these sentiments creep up into the Ummah, the people in Gaza can feel it. You see them, they say, you realize like you guys are moving on and we're still being slaughtered. Something's not right.
The question is obviously like, if the conflict in Gaza over the past 4 months hasn't led to an escalation in the Muslim world, what will it take? The emotions are at a boiling point, but the action hasn't reached that stage. Like, what will it take? Ramadan's coming up, and the Zionists, Ben Gvir, Netanyahu, and so on, are already talking about blocking off access to Masjid al-Aqsa, and who knows what further restrictions they'll place on Masjid al-Aqsa and what further attacks they'll place on the third holiest site in Islam during the sacred month of ours. If we haven't risen yet, what will it take? Right? And I know that a lot of it is due to the hurt and the sacrifice and the pain and the trauma of the Arab Spring and what we saw happen then, whether it's Egypt and ending up in, however you want to package it, probably a worse situation than what they had previously with Mubarak, whether it's Syria and hundreds of thousands that have been killed while the butcher Bashar is still in power, and so many other countries that have, Yemen and Libya and so on, that have continued to suffer in the decade that has passed. And it's understandable, like, that human aspect of it, we tried 10 years ago and we failed. And all of the people that we know that were at the forefront of that have been killed or are in prison and so on. But we're talking about a situation that is unfolding in front of our eyes, right? The obvious question in response is, if I rise up against these rulers, I'll be killed or I'll be imprisoned or my family will be tortured and so on, which you can't discount. And the point isn't to display this as some sort of like airy-fairy, hunky-dory, you're going to go out and protest against the ruler and happy days, they're going to be overthrown and we're going to overthrow the Zionist occupation. There will be sacrifice, right? We can't discount that. We can't downplay that. There will be sacrifice necessary in order to talk about the change that we're talking about, which is getting rid of these treacherous rulers and really putting in the steps in place to save the people of Gaza and the people of Palestine. But the point is that people are dying already, right? The people of Gaza are dying, right? If I speak out, I might lose my job. The people of Gaza don't have their jobs and their business anymore. If I speak out, my family might go through X, Y, Z, or they won't have their protector and their provider if I'm imprisoned. The people of Gaza don't have their protectors and their providers. I am not more deserving of my job than the people of Gaza are deserving of their jobs. So if something needs to be said, and if there's something that I can say that will produce effective change, and I have the opportunity to say it, but the reason that I stop is because, for example, I could lose my job, then that means that I'm valuing my life and my job over the lives and the jobs of the people of Gaza. If I'm saying that if I go out in the streets and I protest against these treacherous rulers in whatever country, I might get imprisoned, which is a very real threat, and it's not something to belittle. The imams of these massive mosques and the muftis of these countries who all know the Islamic duty in response to Gaza, but they stay silent because they know that they're at the grip of the rulers and the tyrants over these countries, and I have to say what I've been commanded to say, otherwise I'll be imprisoned or my family will be tortured. But the people of Gaza have been imprisoned and tortured, and they're not more deserving of imprisonment and torturement than you are, right? So when you're taking these stances out of protection for yourself or your family or your life, which are all valuable things, we're discounting the fact that an actual genocide is happening before our eyes. And we're refusing to take the steps necessary to stop it and to prevent future actions similar to this, because it might be that we say, let's just continue until this dies out. But the same exact circumstances that caused this genocide which is the existence of Israel as a state, which is the existence of the Zionist occupation, if that same circumstance continues to exist, there's nothing stopping another genocide in 2 years or 5 years or 10 years.
And there's nothing stopping it from spilling over the borders into Jordan and into Egypt and into Syria and into Lebanon.
Especially with the genocidal talk of the Zionists.
And the Zionist occupation and their plans for a greater Israel. The greater Israel is a piece of Jordanian land, a piece of Egyptian land, a piece of Syrian land, and a piece of Lebanese land.
And all the way to Iraq, the Nile to the Euphrates.
Yeah, that's their plan. And they say it to us. It's open. The same way they've told us that their plan is to take over all of Palestine, and we decided to ignore it previously. And today, when we see the mass genocide that's pushing the people of Gaza possibly into Egypt very soon as a displacement for them to take over all of Gaza, and then Netanyahu comes out and says, after we take over Gaza, we are going to take over West Bank and Jerusalem. Jerusalem's already under their control. West Bank. He says it. Next is West Bank. Everyone's talking about it. Next is West Bank. If Gaza is gone, next is West Bank. Everyone is talking about it. We know it. They know it. Everyone can see it coming.
And they've already sent more forces to the West Bank. There are some reports that they have more soldiers in the West Bank at the moment than they do in Gaza.
Yeah, and that's other than the amount of settlers that have been armed with M16 rifles. We are talking about over 100,000 settlers have been armed with M16 rifles over the past 4 to 5 months by Ben Gvir. Okay? So when they are ramping up for something big in the West Bank and in Jerusalem, this Ramadan coming, they want to prevent the Muslims from under the age of 50 from praying inside Masjid al-Aqsa, from those living in Jerusalem and the 1948 areas. Anyone from the West Bank is not allowed in there. This is the first time it's getting even more strict. So we can see where things are heading. It's clear. From day one, it's clear. We can see that displacement it's days away. Unless Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala changes the affairs, changes things, something happens. If they keep pushing forward and they go into Rafah, and now they're talking about negotiations, new negotiations in Paris. But these negotiations are happening whilst Netanyahu is threatening by going into Rafah. So they're using this card now on the negotiation tables that you need to come down to our level of negotiations, accept our proposals. The Zionists are saying this. Otherwise, this Ramadan, we are in Rafah. This is clear as daylight. And them going into Rafah, we know what's going to happen in terms of massacres, in terms of genocide, in terms of potential displacement into Sinai. So what's coming is much more severe if it does come. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that it does not happen. But this is it. This is the roadmap ahead for the Zionists. Yeah. So we see it coming. And the Ummah sees it coming. The Muslims see it coming. Are they waiting for it to spill over into their own countries, over those borders that were drawn up, for them to actually make some sort of move? Or will things change? Because the longer it prolongs, the more likely the people's expectations, the people's anger, the people's frustration will come to a turning point where it's going to explode. Because don't forget, people can see what's happening. They know where the problem is. And it's just building up. The more you prevent people from speaking in the Arab countries, because if you speak, you're going to get locked up. The more you prevent them, the more it's going to build up. And the more it builds up, it's like a pressure cooker.
That's right.
It's going to come to a point where that's it. People have had enough. Like in Egypt, we saw in the protests in the streets when the revolutions happened. In the other Arab countries, when the revolutions happened, why did they happen? It was as a result of this pressure building up in the people, and it came to a boiling point where they had to just let it all out at once.
We saw the Qatari foreign minister just last week come out and talk about avoiding escalations in Rafah and in the region before Ramadan starts. Because like you mentioned, when people's emotions boil, the pressure cooker builds, and that pressure is going to lead to further action. Ramadan is a point where these emotions build. Ramadan is a point where every single night we're raising our hands in Jama'ah in the mosques and making these du'a'ats. And the du'a around the Ummah, east and west, will be focused on Gaza in many parts. We have talks in Taraweeh, we gather with our families during iftar, we have these discussions, and naturally as Muslims all we talk about is politics. And in that context, they recognize America also is talking about avoiding a Rafah invasion during Ramadan, because they know that Ramadan is a time when emotions escalate, when emotions boil, through our discussions with other people, through our salawat, through our connection with Allah Azza wa Jal, and they fear that. So like you said, this is a time when we'll potentially see an increase in the emotions of the people. But really what we need, as we mentioned, yani there is no doubt that the response of the Muslim Ummah, when we start pointing it towards our rulers, will lead to repercussions in the rest of the Ummah. It will lead to hardship, it will lead to suffering, it will lead to people being tortured, killed, imprisoned. There's no doubt about that. But is there any other way that we see Gaza being protected? Is there any other way that we see Palestine being liberated? It's not going to come from the West, as we described earlier in the episode. It's not going to come from the United Nations. They don't have the intention or the good heart or the power or whatever it is to change the situation of the Zionists. I mean, this is their agenda. This aligns with their interests. Yes, a more marketable genocide like we described, but at the end of the day, this is what they want. This is their plot within the Middle East. It's going to come from the Ummah. How will that change come when we have rulers who are treacherous? And there is no exception to that in the Muslim. Like I challenge anyone, find me an exception, right? Erdogan, who the Ummah saw as a hero and as somebody who talked with Islamic values, he himself has shown himself to be a complete sellout. And the Muslims in Turkey are the ones who are leading the cause against Erdogan today, the sincere Muslims, because they've seen as well the lack of action and the lack of even words from Erdogan recently. So we see that there's no hope in the rulers around the Muslim world. And so when we talk about, where does that responsibility lie? When that responsibility hasn't been taken by the rulers in the surrounding countries, and when there isn't the sufficiency within Gaza or within Palestine to repel the occupiers because they don't have the necessary resources to do so, then the responsibility falls upon the rest of the Ummah.
Yes.
No matter where we are, we need to be willing to sacrifice as much as we can. You know the hadith about the Ummah being like the scum of the ocean,
with that sail.
And
Yes.
and the Prophet ﷺ said that there will be wahm in our hearts, meaning love of this dunya and fear of death, or love of life and fear of death. Isn't that exactly what we're describing when we say that I worry about sacrificing my own life or my own comfort or my own livelihood or my own family?
That's the wahm.
In response to Gaza? Isn't that exactly what it is? Like, I love my life and I fear dying or reducing the quality of my life. Well, the people of Gaza are dying and they're reducing the quality of their life by force.
100%.
So at what point am I going to be willing to sacrifice really everything that I have in order to protect them?
Yeah, subhanAllah, like despite everything we say, despite everything that we see, despite what the Ummah sees where the problem lies, and they've come to realize where the problem lies, this is all from the wisdom of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I truly believe, and these are this is aligned with the sentiments of many in the Ummah and even the people of Gaza, that they see that this battle is the battle of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's a battle that has been orchestrated by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it is all in His affairs and in His control, like everything else in this world. But this one specifically, and it's very similar to the Battle of Badr. And I guarantee you, speak to any analyst, speak to anyone from Gaza, speak to anyone about what the expectations were of the 7th of October attacks and what the outcome of it was. No one thought that this was going to happen, and no one even expected this response. And no one thought that what happened on 7th October was going to be that big. So from what people say, is they've gone into a battle with specific limited targets, military targets and hostages, in order to have a bargaining chip on the table to try and free some prisoners and hostages with the Zionist occupation and gain some political bargaining chips and so on. Bargaining chips on the table. But things were much bigger than they expected. They did not expect
the collapse of the security.
The collapse of the security of brigade, the collapse of the whole brigade, or everything else that happened. And then they did not expect the response of the Zionist occupation to be this big and this strong. No one expected it. No one saw any of this coming, whether from the Palestinian side or from the Zionist side. No one saw this scale of events happening. And the fact that no one saw any of this happening and all of it has been outside of the expectation and outside of the planning shows us that this is the work of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and our trust is in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that through this He has chosen the people of Gaza, that it's as though He has looked into their hearts and He has seen that these people of Gaza are the people ready for such a trial, and He has chosen them for this specific trial, for this specific battle, in order to attain something greater for the Ummah, which we cannot see at the moment, which we do not see, because of how enormous this trial is and how hard it is. Yeah. And as events prolong, we can see the longer they are prolonging, the more masks that have fallen from the regimes and from the rulers, and where they have become more complicit in their crimes in supporting the Zionist entity, despite knowing full well that what they are doing is going to bring the anger and the outrage of their own people. So they are doing stupid things that you shouldn't be doing, like Jordan, Saudi, UAE, opening up their land space for the ships to go through and to feed the Zionist entity. You would think any sane ruler or king would take this opportunity in order to win back the support of his people. Like
doing the exact opposite.
They're doing the exact opposite. Do some propaganda. Do something that's going to trick the people like you usually do. But this time, none of them have done anything. In fact, they have helped the Zionist entity. So all of this is happening, and it's pouring towards one thing, and it's pouring towards making the both parties clear. There are two camps now. It's becoming clearer and clearer. That's it. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is making the camps clearer, dividing the lines, until it comes to a point where Allah chooses those people in the camp of the truth and gives them the victory that they deserve against the people of batil. And inshallah, this is where it's all leading to. And we hope that with Ramadan coming, the month of victories, the month of khair for the Muslims, for the Ummah, that things are going to happen which we do not see, we do not expect, we do not understand how big of things can happen, that these lead to the greater good and to the victory of the people of Palestine and to the liberation of Palestine.
May Allah Azza wa Jal make Ramadan a month of victory for this Ummah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us of those who see the haqq as haqq and who see the batil as batil. Our emotions continue to rise. The more that we see things escalating in Gaza, the more that we see the increase in the crimes, the barbarity of the Zionists, the pain of our brothers and sisters. But through all of this, it's important for us to maintain, in between all of our emotion, a connection with Allah Azza wa Jal, and an ability to look at things analytically, to understand the plots, to understand what's happening, to refer back to the Quran and the Sunnah and the works of our scholars, to understand the Islamic position on these different events, and for us to be able to, I guess, fashion and direct the right response as an Ummah. It's important that we're not swayed to the left and right, swayed by the wind, whichever way our enemies try to point us or try to direct us, and so that we're able to craft out our own response from an Islamic perspective. And it's for that reason, inshallah, that we continue to look at these issues from an Islamic perspective, to look at the relevance of different incidents in the seerah, to look at the relevance of different incidents in our history as an ummah, and to really understand the commands that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has sent down to us in such a trying time like this. Inshallah, Palestine will be free, the people of Gaza will be liberated, Al-Aqsa will be liberated. That time will come, there's no doubt about it, but the question will come back to every single one of us by Allah Azza wa Jalla on the Day of Judgment. What did you do to contribute? So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make each one of us among those who contributed, and may He make the liberation of Palestine a testimony for us, every single one of us, on the Day of Judgment. And I think with that, it's probably where we'll end off this podcast.
We'll end it off here, inshallah, and we'll try to aim to have one more podcast before Ramadan as well.
Definitely.
And the events are obviously happening quick, and there's a lot of things that happen within a few days. So We try and keep everyone up to date and through our different channels. And inshallah, we'll try our best to assist in any way possible, inshallah.
So wherever you're watching this, we're on YouTube now as well as Spotify podcast, Google Podcast, Apple Podcast. Wherever you're watching this, just have a look in the description, in the links that are provided. You'll see access to our different platforms. We're on WhatsApp and Telegram, providing constant updates day by day of the major events happening within Gaza and more broadly in the region. We're on Instagram, providing different updates as well. And inshallah, our podcast will be uploaded onto these different platforms. So please do keep in touch. Please do follow. Please do leave your comments, your questions, offer any suggestions of things that you want to hear us talk about, and spread these around. End of the day, what we need to do as an ummah, those of us who don't have obviously the armies and the political power and so on, what we need to do is to continue to carry the political message and to spread this to the rest of our ummah. Victory won't happen overnight. It comes through ordinary people like me and you, understanding these concepts, changing our mentality, changing the ideas that we hold, and causing this ripple effect, the domino effect, to spread these ideas like wildfire within our ummah and to be able to play our part within the bigger mission. So with that, inshallah, we end. جزاكم الله خيرا. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. سبحانك وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك.
السلام عليكم.